All right, and we are also live on Facebook. To everyone joining us for the Shabbat prayers with Rabbi David Silber, welcome. This is the third of 6 sessions. We will be starting shortly once Rabbi Silber begins. It's a pleasure to have people joining us for our Falls Month classes and for people who want to keep learning. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. As preparation for today's class, if you have a siddur of your own that you prefer, please feel welcome to keep it at hand and keep it open to Kabbalat Shabbat. We will also be sharing something from Sefaria on the screen if you prefer to follow along that way. And with that, here is Rabbi David Silber, who we have the pleasure of learning with this morning. Hello. And just as one point of housekeeping, if you are not directly asking a question to Rabbi Silber, please mute yourself, otherwise we get very odd audio artifacts. And with that, Rabbi Silber, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to be continuing, I think, wrapping up the service we call Kabbalat Shabbat, hopefully now in this hour. So we started last week with talking a little bit about L'cha Dodi. Before we get to L'cha Dodi, just to remind all of us that what we call Kabbalat Shabbat, the service, which is in addition to the standard services of the Jewish people, which have to do with morning, afternoon, evening services, additional services on the holy days, on the days there was a sacrifice in the temple, the Musaf, Ne'ilah on the fast days, we say only on Yom Kippur, etc. But there's this other thing called Kabbalat Shabbat, which fundamentally was created by the mystics of Tzfat in the 16th century. There are several of the more famous mystics, the most famous of whom is the Ari, Yitzchak Luria, and his circle, which included the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, and in addition, Shlomo Alkabetz. And Shlomo Alkabetz is the author of L'cha Dodi. So apart from the Kabbalat Shabbat service, these are some of, if not the most famous mystics of the Jewish people, starting with the Ari. It's all one circle, it's all in Tzfat. And an important thing to remember about Tzfat in the 16th century, and this has been spoken about by many, but we have to remember that one of the most significant events that happened to the Jewish people during the Middle Ages was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. It wasn't always Spain, but the expulsion from Spain is one of those critical events. The Jews in Spain had enjoyed a pretty good experience there. They were part of this great Renaissance in Spain. And then they found themselves not only on the out, but literally out, expelled, forced to convert, forcible conversions. Many fled the country. Even to today, on the Sephardic keynote of Tisha B'Av, on night, it actually mentions the expulsion from Spain in 1492. So we're talking about, that's the end of the 15th century, and we're talking about a community which is gathering in Tzfat, which either directly or indirectly, I mean, all Jews probably, almost all Jews are indirectly affected by the expulsion, but you're talking about Jews who are in many ways directly affected by it. And the world of the Jewish people is actually crumbling all around them. That's important to remember when we think about this Kabbalat Shabbat service, in particular L'cha Dodi, which, if you haven't actually looked at L'cha Dodi in terms of the sources, it's probably the most popular from our prayer services. It's the poem sung most frequently, and probably the most beloved poem of the Jewish people. But when you actually look at what L'cha Dodi says, it's very striking that this is a song composed for the entrance of the Sabbath, because outside of a couple of stanzas, it seems to have very little to do with the Sabbath, remarkably. So I wanted to begin with looking again at L'cha Dodi, and then after we complete that, just to a few additional comments about what we call the Friday night service. That is to say, the Kabbalat Shabbat service, which precedes the evening service of Shabbat. If we have some time, we'll talk about the evening service as well, which is Ma'ariv, and some of the unique features of the Ma'ariv service of Friday night, which is the onset of Shabbat. Okay, so we started last time with L'cha Dodi. I'll stop periodically to take comments and questions. If anyone has a comment they want to make, just unmute yourself and speak up. It's totally fine. So L'cha Dodi began with, and this we ended with last week, the first paragraph actually speaks about Shabbat. Shamar v'zachar b'dibur echad, hishmi'anu el hamyuchad. So last week I concluded with brief discussion about that first paragraph of L'cha Dodi. After the refrain of L'cha Dodi with Rat Kala, which we'll get back to later, discuss that as well. But Shamar v'zachar b'dibur echad is reference to what the Gemara says. Gemara comments that contradiction between what it says in the book of Exodus. Here it says, Zachar Yom HaShabbat L'kadsho, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And what it says in the Devarim, when Moshe retells the Ten Commandments, there it says, Shamar et Yom HaShabbat L'kadsho. So the Gemara is remarking that we have contradiction. One is, what did God say? Did God say Zachar, or did God say Shamar? That's the question. The Gemara comments that God said both. Only God can say two things at the same time. That God actually said both. And the Gemara, Shamar and Zachar for the Gemara has a halachic significance, not relevant to our topic, but since it's that's how L'cha Dodi begins, I simply want to make reference to the halachic significance of Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad. Because just before I make reference to that, I simply want to point out that the word Shamar actually could be translated as Zachar. Zachar and Shamar, we see them as radically different. But in point of fact, Lishmar in biblical Hebrew can mean to remember. And I give you a simple example from the book of Breshit. When Joseph had his dreams, his second dream that the sun, moon, and stars, 11 stars bow down to him, Vayikanu bo echav, his brothers were jealous of Joseph. They had a jealousy towards the one who thinks he's their lord, their superior. And the second half of the verse, in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, V'yaviv shamar et hadavar, but his father shamar et hadavar. What does it mean, his father shamar et hadavar, in context? Clearly, it means he remembered. They discounted it. They thought he's just showing off. However, Jacob, the father, shamar et hadavar. So lishmar and liskar actually can be synonyms. And we understand why, because we hear many, many things in life. We don't remember everything. We remember those things we actually, for whatever reason, we feel are relevant to us or significant to us. Sometimes we remember them when we're awake, and sometimes when we sleep in dreams. So Zachar and Shamar are not two words that are so radically different. Having said that, the Gemara goes down a different path, an important path for the system, which is that Zachar for the Gemara refers to something positive. Shamar, Hishamer, be careful, for the Gemara means don't do X. Hishamer lecha pentaz ovet halevi. Hishamer means don't forsake the Levite, don't forsake the poor person. Shamar is, in the Gemara's words, a mitzvah lotase. It's what you shouldn't do. And Zachar, to remember, is what you should do. So there are mitzvot that are positive mitzvot, and there are negative commandments. They talk about 613 mitzvot, 248 positive, 365 negative. But there are some mitzvot that are both. They're both positive and negative. And the prime example of that is Shabbat. Because Zacharat Yom HaShabbat L'kadsho was taken by the Talmud anyway to be a positive mitzvah, to remember the Shabbat or to mention the Shabbat. It's the mitzvah we call Kiddush. So Kiddush is a mitzvah from the Torah, says the Talmud, and it's based on the verse Zacharat Yom HaShabbat L'kadsho. Now, on the other hand, we have all kinds of negative mitzvot, namely Lo Taseh Kol Melacha, don't do any work, which the Gemara goes on to define what work means. 39 categories of work, etc. And that's a negative commandment. But the Gemara has an interesting comment. The Gemara, which says that women are exempted from time-bound commandments, mitzvot aseh shehazman grama, there are exceptions to that rule. Actually, there are many exceptions. But one of the important exceptions is Shabbos. And Shabbos, women have equal obligation and equal prohibitions on Shabbat. And the Gemara says, why? Isn't Shabbat a time-bound mitzvah? There's no mitzvah more time-bound than Shabbat, the most time-bound mitzvah of all. Says that's true, says the Gemara, it's a time-bound mitzvah. But kosher yeshno b'shmira, yeshno b'schira. So whoever's women are only exempt from positive time-bound commandments. From negative, but negative, they're obligated. So since the women are obligated not to do work, they're under the category of shamar, then by extension, they're obligated in zachar, b'dibur echad, because they came together. Whoever must not violate the Sabbath must also keep the Sabbath. So for example, Kiddush, woman has the same obligation to say Kiddush that a man does. There's no difference there. Because yeshno b'shmira, yeshno b'schira. Even given the Talmudic system of how they divide up exemptions for women, but Shabbat is different. Why? Because zachar v'shamar b'dibur echad. Because those two things came simultaneously, meaning if you're obligated in one, you're obligated in the other. So that's sort of the legalistic side of zachar v'shamar b'dibur echad. Fine. Having said that, and of course we talk about the Shabbat, but having said that, and I ended last week with the Ramban. There's a long Ramban on the Ramban on the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus. It's a Ramban everybody should be familiar with. It's one of the most famous Rambans. And he says all kinds of interesting things. I mean, the Ramban is always interesting. This is in particular interesting. And the Ramban makes the claim, you have to remember that apart from being one of, if not the greatest Talmudic scholar of the Middle Ages of his time, and one with enormous influence, he is on top of that one of the important mystics. And his commentary on the Torah has a mystical piece to it. Actually, more than one mystical piece to it, but that's the Ramban. The Ramban makes the claim that Zachar and Shamar reflect two aspects of the Shabbat. Just want to refresh our memories. The Ramban said that the night of Shabbat he calls Shamar. Shamar means you don't really do much, but you are accepting the Shabbos. That's how he understands the evening. The evening is the time of acceptance. So it's more passive, but it's acceptance. In the imagery of the Kabbalists, everything is divided male and female for them. The night has a feminine aspect to it. But the daytime is when you actually keep the Shabbos in the active sense. You read the Torah, you have your Shabbat meals, of course. The Ramban said in those days they used to travel to see the prophet on Shabbat. Shabbat has an active side, and that's reflected in the term that the Talmud uses for the Kiddush of the daytime. The Kiddush of the daytime is only rabbinic. The only real Kiddush is at night to welcome the Shabbat. But the Talmud called the Kiddush in the day Kiddusha Rabbah, the great Kiddush. And they didn't mean that in some synagogues they're spending $1,000 or thousands of dollars on Kiddush. And not only that, in the middle of the davening, some men feel compelled to go out to the Kiddush club, usually during the Haftorah or something like that. And on top of that, they even think it's a mitzvah, believe it or not. Hard to imagine, isn't it? In any event, that's not why it's called Kiddusha Rabbah, says the Ramban. Not because of the Kiddush club. It's called Kiddusha Rabbah, says the Ramban, because it's reflective of the day of the Shabbos. The day of the Shabbos, the masculine aspect, is when you actually keep the Shabbos. And the Ramban makes this point elsewhere as well, in a very important way. Yes, this class is about the davening, but it's also about Shabbos. And the Ramban says a very, very important thing about the holidays in general, the holy days in general. The Torah speaks about Shabbaton, refraining from work. And the Ramban says that if you could, theoretically, suppose you sleep the whole Shabbos. And you get up to daven or something, you sleep the whole Shabbos. So the Ramban says, if you sleep the whole Shabbos, you didn't do melacha, but you didn't actively keep the Shabbos either. Because Shabbaton for the Ramban means in all the holy days, an active keeping of the day, whether it's the study of Torah, whether it's special meals, whether it's community, whatever it is, that's part of the positive side of Shabbat, says the Ramban. Great way if he talks about all the festivals. It's not just not doing something. Shabbat should be an active participation and active involvement with the sanctity of Shabbos. The word kiddush means holy. Kodesh is holy. You sanctify the day. And the Ramban talks about sanctifying the day through what we do. So Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad, which is how Al-Kabetz begins his poem. That's taken from the Talmud. Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad. What did God say? Did God say Zachar? Did God say Shamar? So the Talmud says b'dibur echad. God said both at the same time. Person can't do that. Can't say two different things at the same time, but God can do it. So that's how Al-Kabetz begins his thing. And for Al-Kabetz, who was a mystic, Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad, no doubt, has that connotation that we have already in the Ramban. That b'dibur echad, Shabbos is very special, that it has both of these elements. It's about accepting the Shabbos on one hand, Kabbalat Shabbat, because Shabbos comes whether you like it or not, every 7 days of Shabbos. Okay, it comes. We are also we greet the Shabbos. And then it has the other aspect of the active fulfilling of the Shabbos. By the way, before we continue with Luchad Dodi, you should simply know that the Ibn Ezra famously had a different understanding of Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad. The Ibn Ezra says, what did God say? Did God say Zachar, as it says in Exodus chapter 20, or did God say Shamar, as it says in Devarim chapter 5? Which one did God say? Says the Ibn Ezra. Are you sure God said any of those? Maybe God said a third thing. It's not actually recording what God said. It's an interpretation of what God said. Maybe God said something different. So in the book of Shemot, it's written Zachar. That's our interpretation of what God might have said. And in the book of Devarim, it says Shamar. That's an interpretation of God, what God might have said. But maybe God said neither Zachar nor Shamar. The fact that it's written down Zachar and Shamar doesn't mean that's what God said, says the Ibn Ezra. It means that that's how the book is understanding something that God said. It's a very, very well-known Ibn Ezra with all kinds of interesting implications. In any event, it's not a topic. But anyway, let's get back to the poem of Luchad Dodi. Okay, so Luchad Dodi Likrat Kala. Now, first of all, we call this Luchad Dodi. You have to remember something else about the Kabbalists in general. And it's certainly true of Luchad Dodi. I mentioned this last week. The Kabbalists actually, this is the one thing, the one prayer service the Kabbalists pretty much invented. They didn't really fully invent it in Tzfat because it already predated. It already have something in the Gemara about welcoming the Shabbos. And we know that there was an earlier custom that before they prayed the evening prayer on Shabbat, they would say Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, that song. So what the Kabbalists did was they very much expanded an existing tradition. It's an expansion. It's not creation out of nothing. And the same thing is true of our prayers in general, which are rabbinic. They're written by various scholars over generations, Asher Knesset Agdola, whatever. But the important point, and those who have studied with me remember this, that they draw typically from biblical verses. They've drawn, behind the rabbinic prayers are biblical verses. And it's certainly true of Luchad Dodi. And what's striking about Luchad Dodi is which verses Al-Kabetz chose for his poem. So the first verse of Luchad Dodi Likrat Kala, Pnei Shabbat Mikabla, that without question is drawn from a verse in Shir HaShirim. The verse in Shir HaShirim is Luchad Dodi Neitzei HaSadeh Novina Bakfarim. The Song of Songs talks about the lover, the beloved, the lover, the dode, and the raya. And it's a love song, obviously. It's the only song it's the only part of our Bible, I think, that is truly written from the feminine perspective. The main speaker in Shir HaShirim is a woman. It's very unusual for the Bible. In fact, I don't think we have it elsewhere. It's from the woman's perspective for the most part. The man gets a part too, but the main player in the book is the woman. The woman that calls to the man, let's go out to the field and let's lie down together in the villages, etc. So Luchad Dodi is a phrase from Shir HaShirim, and that's how Al-Kabetz begins his poem. This is a love poem, as it were. And it's also interesting to note that this most famous song that we have entire services is drawn from the Song of Songs. And the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, in many communities, is actually recited Friday night. In fact, not only is it recited Friday night by many communities before Kabbalat Shabbat, that's a widespread practice, but actually I was in a synagogue in Israel, not in this past trip, but in past, and on Friday night, they don't say the first 5 songs at all. But after L'cha Dodi, they say Shir HaShirim. They actually read Shir HaShirim. Different people read different chapters. And so Shir HaShirim for them is part and parcel of the service. It's not something that precedes the service. It actually is right smack in the middle of what we call Kabbalat Shabbat. It's very striking. L'cha Dodi, the refrain is playing off Shir HaShirim. Okay. So now we have, just wanted to make one other comment about that first paragraph. Shama b'zacha b'dibur echad, hishmi'anu el ha'miuchad. So Al-Kabetz makes reference to the statement in the Talmud that they will b'dibur echad. Hashem echad u'shmo echad. L'shem v'tiferes v'letila. Now that is a Kabbalistic reference, which I'll get to in one moment. I do want to make one point. Many people have written about the Kabbalistic pieces of L'cha Dodi. The largest, to my knowledge, the one who's dealt with it extensively, is a professor from Brandeis named Reuven Kimmelman. Kimmelman has it's a book or a very long article about L'cha Dodi, about all the mystical references. And there's certainly an enormous amount of truth in what Kimmelman is saying, but I did want to make the point that it's using Kabbalistic terminology, and why wouldn't it? He's a Kabbalist, and not just terminology. For Al-Kabetz, the Shabbat does say something about a mystical interpretation of what it means to enter into the Shabbat. That's true. But from our perspective, I'll speak for myself and probably for many of us, when we're less interested in the specific Kabbalistic moves and more interested in how this prayer actually can speak to us non-Kabbalists. So it uses Kabbalistic terminology, but I think it still can be seen as very relevant, I presume, to our own selves, wherever we may stand. You have to be a Kabbalist to appreciate L'cha Dodi. But I do want to make a couple of references to the Kabbalistic piece of L'cha Dodi. And here's the main point I want to make about the Kabbalistic piece. As you know, the Kabbalists speak of a God who's beyond everything. And Ein Sof is completely beyond human understanding. The unfathomable God, the Ein Sof, the God who's above and beyond. Okay, then we have the God who manifests in a world that we can't connect to. And the Kabbalists speak of these emanations of God. They call them sfirot, other things as well, call them sfirot, and there are different emanations. And there are 10 of them. And from top to bottom, the one on the bottom is called Malchut, kingship. It has many other names as well. Another one would be Shechina, it's another name. And it's identified with certain things. Knesset Israel, Mikdash. These all come under the general rubric of Shechina. And in the Kabbalistic world, they divided everything into masculine and feminine. It's a binary system, masculine and feminine. And fundamentally, it's more complex than that, but fundamentally, the last Sephira, the bottom one, Shechina or Malchut, is fundamentally a feminine Shechina, the world in which we live, basically. Shechina is the world in which we live, the last of the Sefirot. It's identified, it's seen as primarily a feminine reflection of God. It's identified very often because the Kabbalists identified these different Sefirot with different personalities. It's identified often with the matriarch Rachel, Rachel. Rachel is identified with Shechina, with Mikdash, etc. So Shechina is the world in which we live. And the world in which we live is a problematic world, obviously. And the world in which we live, for the Kabbalists, without getting into all the details of this, and this is not my area of expertise, but the female side of God, female side of God, which is related also to judgment, but for whatever reason, evil more easily creeps in there. So the world in which we live has potentially a negative side to it. That's the world in which we live. Now now there's another of the emanations, which is called Tiferet. Tiferet is, again, there are 10 emanations. So the top 3 are the bottom 7 are different than the top 3, but the bottom 7 of them, you have of the top 3 of the bottom 7, right? So there's one on the right, one on the left, and one in the center. The one on the right is the quality of chesed. The one on the left is the quality of gvura or strength. The one on the right is identified typically with Abraham. The one on the left of gvura, strength, judgment, etc., is identified typically with Isaac, with Yitzchak. Then there's the one in the middle, which is identified with Jacob, with Yaakov, who is seen as a combination of the two, of gvura, of din, of tzimtzum, of contraction, judgment, that's Isaac, together with chesed, with outpouring, with grace, etc., that's Abraham. The middle one is a combination of the two, which is known in the Kabbalistic world as the quality of Tiferet. That's Tiferet. It's identified with Jacob, and it's related to many other things. It's related to the name of God, Yud Hey Vav Hey, because the Sefirot have different names of God too, and it's seen as the world that actually could be, the kind of the possible world, kind of redeemed world. It's also related to the quality of kindness, of rachamim, of compassion. So there is, for the Kabbalists, of all the Sefirot, the 2 that are most significant, I would say, for our purposes are the bottom one, which is Shechina, which has one name of God, and then there's this Tiferet. And Tiferet is the world that we imagine could be. And the idea of prayer for the Kabbalists is you enter in the world that is, and you imagine the world that could be. That's how the Kabbalists understood prayer. In the past, I've spoken about, not from a Kabbalistic standpoint, but from a plain reading of the Tanakh, that I believe is what Chana's prayer is about. She walks into the world as is, which is problematic, and she imagines a different world. So the way this begins, the way the poem of L'cha Dodi starts, Shamar v'zoch Hashem echad u'shmo echad. One day God will be one and God's name will be one. V'yom hu Hashem echad u'shmo echad. That's the end of Aleinu, right? And the Talmud comments, today God's name doesn't have all 4 letters. God is somehow incomplete. God is somehow hidden from us. The world in which we walk, we don't see God in the world always. In fact, very often we don't see God at all. Hester Panim. But someday, right? Someday God's world will be, God's name will be one, means we'll have all 4 letters of God's name. Rashi on the Chumash actually commented on this, because in the war against Amalek, Moshe builds an altar, and Moshe says, Ki yad al kesiyah. God's hand is on the throne. God swears. But the name of God is Yud Hey. But the great name of God is Yud Hey Vav Hey. So God swears, that one day, when I eliminate Amalek from the world, Amalek is an obstacle, prevents God from being fully realized in the world. Someday we'll get rid of Amalek. And when evil is banished, then God's name will be complete. So there is a sense of God's name not being complete. And another way to say it is, the world in which we walk, there's evil, there's hiddenness, etc. But someday, Hashem echad u'shmo echad, one day God's name will be full, will be perfect. Shame, Tiferet, V'Latilu. I presume that shame refers to shame is the sphere that we're in, and Tiferet is this perfect world. So one day, those 2 worlds will be connected. One day there won't be a difference between the world in which we live and the world that we imagine. So now what is the relevance for the poem? So for our Kabbats, that's what Shabbos represents. Shabbos represents a world that is perfected, That's what he's getting at over here with the Kabbalistic terminology. Shama v'zachar b'dibur echad. At Shabbos, the idea of Shabbos is a kind of unifier. That the negative commandment, that's all one. That all the aspects of Shabbos are actually one, and they reflect a world in which the evil has been banished. Now, there is another practice of Sephardic Jews and also Hasidic Jews, that the Hasidic Jews, on Friday night, so there were two different customs, that in addition to the Kabbalat Shabbat service, there's a custom to recite something, after which we have a Kaddish, or something added into the davening. For the Ashkenazim, the practice of the Ashkenazim is that Friday night, to recite the second chapter of Tractate Shabbat, the Mishnayot, Bamen Madlikin Uvama'in Madlikin. These are laws that relate to the lighting of the Shabbat, begins with the laws of the Shabbos candles. And it was put into the service for whatever reason. I mean, you stop, Shabbos is beginning, and we're accepting the Shabbos. So they felt it was appropriate to read or study laws relating to the onset of the Shabbos, and the laws that relate to the onset of the Shabbos, which are in the second chapter of Tractate Shabbat, begin with the lighting of the candles. The lighting of the candles is the acceptance of the Shabbos. That's the Ashkenazic custom. But the Sephardim, or some of the Sephardim and the Hasidim, had a different custom. What do they say instead of Bameh Madlikin? What do the Sephardim say? What do the Hasidim say?
Kagavna.
They say Kagavna. Yeah, Kagavna is actually one of the most beautiful prayers that we have, period. And Kagavna is a Kabbalistic text. And what Kagavna speaks about is the idea that when Shabbos comes, all the negativities are banished. And there's a kind of, the world is kind of unified under the banner of Shabbos, right? There's actually a very famous, for those interested in Jewish music, is a very, very famous Chazonish piece for Kagavna, which has been performed in many settings. Rosa de Shabbos. Those who I highly recommend it. Rosa de Shabbos was written by Chazan Pinchik, and you can get it on Google. It's terrific. And there have been many great Chazanim have sung Rosa de Shabbos. And Rosa de Shabbos is exactly this: the secret, the mystery of the Shabbos. That somehow on Shabbos, Chodinin misabrim mina, all of the negativities, all the harsh judgments, everything is banished, and under the banner of the Shabbos, it all becomes one. And that, I think, is very much in keeping with what Al-Kabetz has in mind over here in Luchah Dodi. That Shabbos is, as it says, Be'ein Olam Haba. It reminds us of a perfected world. That's the idea of the Shabbos. So that's the first paragraph of Luchah Dodi, and it actually talks about Shabbos, which is not surprising, because it's a poem written for the acceptance of the Shabbos. That's paragraph number 1. Now let's get to paragraph number 2, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. L'krat Shabbat l'chu v'nelcha, paragraph number 2. So let us go and greet the Shabbos. Kihi mekar habracha. Merosh mikedem nesucha sof maaseh v'machshava tchila. So let's greet the Sabbath. Let's go greet the Sabbath. The source of blessing, mekar habracha. Merosh mikedem nesucha. She had been, I would say, anointed or chosen from the beginning. Sof maaseh v'machshava tchila. The last thing created, but first in thought. So this is a reference to, obviously, the description in the first chapter of the Torah, the creation of the world, Shamayim va'aretz, and the Torah speaks of God creating in 6 days. And on the 7th day, God is resting. And God sanctified by a Kadesh, God sanctified, and God blessed the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the 7th day, which is the last day of creation. So Al-Kabetz says in his poem, it may be the last day of creation, but it's the source of all blessing. Sof maaseh v'machshava tchila. It is the last thing that God created, but the first in God's thought. Now, exactly what that means, the first in God's thought, is a very good question. And I just wanted to make one comment about what that might mean. And then I'll stop and take comments or questions. I've recently been reading a little book called, it's not so little actually, a book called Pachad Yitzchak. Pachad Yitzchak is a collection of writings about the holidays. It was written by Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe 70s as well. It's very interesting. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, and he wrote a book called Pachad Yitzchak. And he has he's very interesting in general, for any number of reasons. He was a pupil of the Alter of Slobodka, and he was a pupil of Rav Kook. Actually, it's very striking. And you can, when you read it, you see Rav Kook there, actually. Then later in life, for a number of reasons, he sort of distanced himself from Rav Kook. It's a whole story over there. But anyway, that's where he's coming from. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva of a Litvish Yeshiva, but he wrote this Pachad Yitzchak. So he has in this Pachad Yitzchak some very interesting things there. Again, after we think about it, is it really right, wrong, right, whatever, it's always interesting though. And he talks about Rosh Hashanah. And in the context of Rosh Hashanah, he references the famous story of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says in Menachot that Moshe Rabbeinu, God brought Moshe Rabbeinu into the famous story, into the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. He's sitting in the back, and he doesn't understand a single thing Rabbi Akiva is saying. He doesn't know what Rabbi Akiva is getting at. Rabbi Akiva is the main proponent of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh. He's the great Torah Sheba'al Peh person. He has the great pupils. The Mishnah, basically, the pupils of Rabbi Akiva. So Moshe Rabbeinu is sitting in the back of the room there, and Moshe says to God, listen, if you have this fellow, why do you give me the Torah? Why do you give Rabbi Akiva the Torah? Why do you give me? And God says to Moshe, be quiet. I had, what does it mean? It could be, this is my will, or it could mean something else. And then there's a second story. Moshe sees Rabbi Akiva being tortured to death. And Moshe turns to God and says, this is the reward for his Torah. God says to Moshe, be quiet. So what does it mean? So Rav Hutner says, which I always thought it meant as well, that I had considered this for myself. And where he takes this is very interesting. Where he takes this idea is that Rosh Hashanah, it represents the first idea of creation, the creation of the first chapter. Before you get to the second creation story, and Rashi comments that the first chapter in the Torah, the name of God is actually Elohim. The name Elohim is typically related to God's judgment. Hashem is the personal God, Yud Vav, the merciful God, the personal God. And what God is saying according to Rav Hutner, saying to Moshe is, yes, I had thought to build my world this way, a world based on pure judgment. And nobody's innocent. And I decided that the world can't exist. The world is Hashem Elohim, is judgment and mercy together. And that the story of Rabbi Akiva is he's being judged for whatever reason, he's being judged as if the world did have the aspect of mercy. Only had the aspect of judgment. And Rav Hutner goes on to talk about Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh Hashanah reminds us of that other world which might have been created. So I was thinking about that in terms of what the Chadodi is saying. The idea that actually what God had thought to do, perhaps, says the Kabbalist, is to have a world which is just Shabbos, not the 6 days of work, not these other days. The perfect world would be a world where everything is perfect, everything's in its place, a world of judgment, a world of equity, without compassion, without just the perfect world. And Shmuel Kabbatz is saying that actually those Shabbos came last, but actually in the ideal world is actually the Shabbos. Sof Maaseh, it may be the last created thing, but the Machshava Tchila, it represents a world that actually could be, and therefore it becomes image of a kind of messianic world, of a perfected world, that God thought to have this messianic world from the very beginning. And for whatever reason, God decides not to do that, create Shabbos only at the end after the 6 days. But in God's thinking, in God's thought, the idea was to have a world just of Shabbat, that the whole creation should be, the world should always be Shabbos. There shouldn't be the days of the week, just have Shabbos. And this is, again, this leads you towards a view of Shabbos as a kind of messianic dream. Now, before I take comments or questions, I just want to point out that the first 2 paragraphs of Lecha Dodi talk about Shabbos, but the whole bunch that follow seem to have nothing to do with Shabbos at all. They're irrelevant to Shabbos. You can't understand why we sing it on Shabbos, even as we'll see in a moment, but there is some connection. I think what I've just said now is actually the link between what comes next and what we've just seen. But before we continue, are there any comments or questions about Lecha Dodi or in general?
No questions in the chat and no questions in
No
the
questions.
Facebook
Okay,
chat
I'll
either.
continue. Okay, fine.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, Rabbi, I do have a question. I was on mute. I'm
Yes.
sorry. I'm a little bit bothered what you said about what the Ibn Ezra said about Shamor and Zachor, that it was not said by Hashem. Does he think that things in the
Right.
Torah were not all said by Hashem?
Right, you're bothered by what the Ibn Ezra said. Well, first of all, you may have to take it up with the Ibn Ezra, because I'm just reporting what he's saying. Sometimes I say what other people say, they start yelling at me. Why'd you say? It's not me. It's what
Is
the
that
Ibn
what
Ezra
he's
is saying.
Is that what you were saying?
That's one way to resolve some of the contradictions. The Ibn Ezra famously said, he did actually say it, that we shouldn't assume these are the actual words, but rather it's a kind of interpretation. God may have said something, and the book of Devarim, Moshe says in the book of Sefer Devarim, this is what God is talking to the people. This is what God told you. Shamar es Yom HaShabbat U'Kadsho. That is what the Ibn Ezra said, and yes, it does open the door to many other possibilities in terms of the words of the Torah. That's why it's quoted all the time, because he does seem to suggest that what's written can be seen as an interpretation of God's word rather than the actual words of God. That is true. By the way, he's not the only one. He says that, but there's some of the other commentaries say things that are not that different, actually. The fact that we have been educated a certain way to believe that, there's a monolithic view of the words of the Torah, it's actually God's words and all that, that doesn't seem to accord with, that maybe certainly is present in many of our teachers and many of our writings, but it's not the only voice. There are other voices as well. That is what the Ibn Ezra says, and yes, it raises the question about many other texts and many contradictions, for sure, 100%.
Thank you.
All right, let me just continue a bit with this. I wanted to finish with Lecha Dodi. Where I am now, it's this morning. I'm back in New York, but in this session, let's continue. Mikdash Melech Ir Melucha Kumitzi Mitocha Hafecha Rav Loch Shevet B'Yemek Habacha V'Yachamo Alayich Chemla. Now, this is the first of several paragraphs that don't mention Shabbat at all, and seemingly have nothing to do with Shabbat at all. Mikdash Melech is the temple of the king, Ir Melucha, the city of God's kingship. This is a reference to, obviously, Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash. So Al-Kabas is addressing Jerusalem and addressing the temple. Arise, get up from amidst the destruction. The temple's been destroyed. La'apok is to turn upside down. So Al-Kabas turns his attention to the temple. Rav Loch Shevet B'Yemek, enough. It's long enough you are sitting in the valley of tears, Emek HaBacha, which is taken to be valley of tears. Probably doesn't actually mean valley of tears, but that's how we take it. That's how Al-Kabas is taking it. Hu Yachamo, and God shall show you mercy. So this paragraph is about the temple. It's about Yerushalayim, and Al-Kabas is saying or praying that the status of Yerushalayim and the status of the temple will be reversed. Right? We've had enough. Rav Loch Shevet, you're sitting as a mourner, is sitting amidst the destruction long enough. God should have compassion upon you. That's paragraph number 3. Paragraph number 4, Hitna'ari me'afar kumi. Stir yourself and arise from the ashes. Livshi big day tifratech ami. I'll get back to this line in a minute. Put on your clothing of, again, the word tiferet appears. Put on the clothing of tiferet, ami, my people. Al Yad ben Yishai Beit Halachmi, through the intervention of the son of Jesse, that's David, from Bethlehem, that's the messianic line. Karval nafshi ge'elah, we are near, or I hope for your redemption. Your redemption is dear to me, is close to my heart. So this once again speaks of referring presumably to the same person or the same setting as the previous stanza, which is Yerushalayim. And once again, here it talks about specifically messianic redemption. And the next paragraph is the same thing. Hit-oreri, stir yourself, arise. Kiva orech, your light has come. Shine, your light has come. Uri, arise, shir daberi, sing. Kavod Hashem alayich nigod, the glory of God shall be upon you. Now, these are 3 paragraphs, and they all seem to be pretty much along the same lines. Namely, it's not talking about Shabbos at all. It's talking about God's presence. It's talking about the temple, or it's talking about Jerusalem, which is also the temple, because the temple has many different spaces. Yerushalayim is part of the temple. It's the outer part of the temple. For example, when you bring sacrifices to the temple, some sacrifices must be eaten inside the temple, and some sacrifices are eaten in the city of Jerusalem. Because the city of Jerusalem, for some purposes, has the status of the temple. So what does this have to do with why is Al-Kabitz somehow shifts all of a sudden from Shabbos, which is the first 2 paragraphs, to Jerusalem and the Messianic hope for Jerusalem, which is paragraphs number 3, 4, and 5. And here, let me just begin by saying that one of the striking features of Lecha Dodi is if you look for the sources for much of the language of Lecha Dodi, there are different biblical sources for Lecha Dodi. But the most prominent biblical source for Lecha Dodi, or many of these pieces are playing off, is actually the latter half of the book of Yeshayahu. Beginning in chapter 40, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, what the academics call Isaiah 2, clearly it's a whole different feel to it. And these are chapters basically of, we call them consolation. In fact, between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, we read 7 haftarot from Yeshayahu after chapter 40, and known as Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 haftarot of consolation. So much of the languages of those haftarot is found in Lecha Dodi. Kumi ori kiva orech, uchvod Hashem olayich zorach. It's the haftarah for the 6th of the 7 haftarahs of consolation, right? It oreri Yerushalayim from Isaiah. Here you have it, right? It oreri, right? Kiva orech kumi ori. A lot of the language here is coming from, not all of it, but a lot of the language of Lecha Dodi is drawn from the Haftarot of Yeshayahu, the last part of Yeshayahu, which talks about consolation, rebuilding, God's presence, reemerging, etc. So we have over here in 3, 4, and 5, let me begin by saying that what strikes me is that for Al-Kabitz, for the poem, it starts with Shabbos, it's going to end with Shabbos. But Al-Kabitz sees in Shabbos the same way that the Shabbat is a precursor to a kind of ultimate redemption. In fact, that was maybe God's intention from day one, before day one, I would say, to have only Shabbos. Okay, it doesn't work that way, but Shabbos is precursor to this ultimate redemption when God will be complete. For the Kabbalists, this process is taking place within God. That's what the Kabbalists believed. The Rambam probably thought it was utter heresy, but the Kabbalists believe this. And then there's the history, which is going to conclude with the rebirth, with God's presence once again. And God's presence is presented in terms of the temple. In thinking about this, it actually works well with another class I'm teaching now, elsewhere, and that is, you remember, the Chumash actually begins with two creation stories. The first creation story is the creation of the heaven and earth in 6 days, and God rests on the seventh day. And then the second creation story is the story of the Garden of Eden, that within the heaven and earth is one specific place, and that God chose a particular place, which is a garden within Eden. There's Eden, is the Gan Be'eden. That's where God chooses to walk. That's where God is present. That's where the human can interact with God. True, we are banished from Eden, and the rest of the Chumash is the attempt to find the alternative to Eden, the Mikdash, as it were. So if you think about the way the Torah begins, that the first creation narrative, actually, the capstone of the first creation narrative is actually Shabbos. Shabbos is the culmination of the creation story in chapter 1, and Shabbos is sacred time. So the Shabbos is sacred time, which is the for our Kabbats was the whole purpose of creation, was to create a sacred time. Initially, God thought to do it alone without the 6 days, and for whatever reason, God chooses to have the 6 days first and Shabbos at the end. But b'machshava tchila, that's the first creation narrative. The second creation narrative is not sacred time, but sacred space. The second creation narrative is within heaven and earth. There's a particular place that God chooses where God is present and when the human being can interact with God. And true, due to our misdeed, we're banished from there, but the goal is to recreate Eden in a different setting, a different kind of Eden, and that works in the Chumash in terms of the temple, it works in terms of the Mishkan, etc. So those two things in the Chumash actually side by side. Gan Eden and Shabbos are actually side by side, and I presume that the mystic over here sees that, and that's why the mystic jumps from sacred time, which Shabbos is the primary example of sacred time, and a harbinger of things to come. And suddenly we're in Mikdash Melech Imelucha, but there too, one day there will be, God's presence will be once again fully emerge. And this will happen through the Messianic times and through the Messianic Redeemer, Ayad ben Yishai, Beit HaLachmi, Karval Nafshi Giyala. So that's the way it's structured over here. Shabbos is emblematic of an ultimate redemption of God, as it were. And of course, because the keeping of the Shabbos, and this is a Kabbalistic idea, the keeping of the mitzvot aids the process within God. The reason the Chabadniks stop you in the street and want you to put on tefillin, at least they want the men to put on tefillin, the reason is not only because they want you to do a mitzvah. That's not actually the thinking there. The thinking is that by Jews doing mitzvot, they hasten this kind of divine process. That's what it's about, actually. It's the Kabbalistic thinking. It's very important. The mitzvot that we do, the keeping of the Shabbos actually hastens the redemptive process. That's where our Kabbos is coming from. Let me make just a couple more comments here. Less time than I like. I want to make a couple other comments. The primary text that Chadodi draws upon, strikingly, are the prophecies of consolation from the book of Yeshayahu. Many of the language of the Shiva de Nechemta, in fact, are in Chadodi. That is not, I'm not suggesting that those are the only biblical texts. There are other biblical texts, and I'll mention one of them now, and next, I guess we'll have to complete this next week, but I'll mention one. But before I mention one, I want to mention another thought that we will talk about. So I want to talk about another thought which emerges from Chadodi, from what I just said. It's interesting about Shabbos, actually. When you think about the language in our prayers that is identified with Shabbos, what's interesting is that the word that comes to mind, because we're talking about the Shiva de Nechemta, the Haftarot of consolation. What's interesting is, for example, in Birkat HaMazon of Shabbat, we'll discuss this another time as well, but on Shabbat, when we have the Birkat HaMazon, after we eat our meal, so there's a paragraph we add for Shabbat. On the festivals, Rosh Chodesh, we add Yalav V'Yavo. But on Shabbos, we had something different. Ritzei, it's called. Ritzei Hashem Elokeinu, right? Ritzei v'achritzei Hashem Elokeinu, mitzvosecha. Mitzvot Yom HaShabbat HaGadol v'Hakadosh Hazeh. We'll talk about that prayer. What's interesting, first of all, about the prayer of Ritzei in the benching for Shabbos is that I was looking at some old Sidurim, I think Sadia, the earliest Sidurim, and that he has two different texts for Mincha on Shabbat. We'll get to that. The one that we say, Atah Echad B'Shimcha Echad, that's one text. But the alternative version he has is very similar to what we add on Shabbat and in terms of Birkat HaMazon, of Ritzei. And what's striking, when you look at Ritzei, you see something very interesting that I want to talk about during these series of classes, not now. The idea of Shabbat as a day of consolation, right? What do we say in Ritzei? Please, God, on this day of Sabbath, relieve us from anguish, from suffering. And God, show us the consolation of Zion, your city. Yerushalayim, your Kodshech, and your holy Jerusalem. For you are the master of redemption and the master of consolation. So it's actually very striking. I want to talk about that in the future, that the word we identify with Shabbat, believe it or not, is the word nechama, consolation. I mention this just in the context of noting that Lecha Dodi draws upon the prophecies of Isaiah from 2nd Isaiah, which are prophecies of consolation. In fact, the Haftarot are called Shiva Dinechemta, the 7 Haftarot of consolation. So I wanted to reflect upon this together with you. What does that mean that Shabbos is a day of consolation? I want to talk about that. I think there's some interesting things to think about in connection with the Shabbat. Before I conclude here now, I want to point out one other thing about a text that Al-Kabetz has marshaled here in Lecha Dodi, and that is in the 5th paragraph. We'll have to go back to some other things next week and finish Lecha Dodi. There's more to say here. But rise, arise. This is from Isaiah, straight up from Yeshayahu. Kiva orech kumi ori, uri shir daberi. Arise, arise, shir daberi, and speak and talk either a song or a poem. Kvod Hashem olayech nikra. Uri shir daberi. Where is that from? Where did Al-Kabetz draw that from? Uri shir daberi. So it strikes me what he had in mind. It's not from Isaiah. The first part is all Isaiah, almost word for word Isaiah. But Uri shir daberi is taken from a different book altogether. It's taken from the book of Judges. And the 5th chapter of the book of Judges is the song of Deborah, Shirat Devorah, Vatasha Devorah Ubarak ben Avinoam. That's chapter 5. And Devorah sings her song. And let's find this over here. Verse number 12, chapter 5, book of Judges. Uri Devorah, Uri Dabri Shir, Kumbarak, Ushaveh Shev Yecha ben Avinoam. Suddenly, in the middle of her songs, the song of Deborah, she says, Uri, she talks to herself. Uri Devorah, Uri Dabri Shir. So what Al-Kabetz does is, in Lecha Dodi, he starts with Hit Orari, which is from Isaiah. Talks to Zion, talks to Zion. Rise up, right? Stir yourself, awaken, because your light has come. The Redeemer is coming. Kiba orech kumi ori. And then he adds from Uri shir daberi, Kvod Hashem olayech nigla. That's taken from the song of Devorah. And it's interesting because Uri dabri shir is what Devorah says about to herself in the context of a shir. Oz tashir Devorah, right? But vatasha Devorah. So it strikes me that Al-Kabetz is talking either to himself or to us. He's instructing us, arise, and sing a song. Lecha Dodi is a shir. It's not just another piece of davening. It's actually within the service, there's a song. I mean, all of Tehillim can be seen as a song, but this is actually, looks like a real song. It has stanzas, it has refrain, and he recalls for us the song of one of the great songs of our tradition, Song of Dvorah. And he makes reference, he says, he talks to Tzion, it Ori, Uri, Dabri Shir is not to Tzion. It may be also a reference to ourselves, to himself, in fact, that we should all be sing a song to Shabbos, right? In fact, right after we say Ucha Dodi, what's the first thing we say? Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, which we'll talk about as well. It's very interesting. So there's a bunch of different things happening at the same time. There's the invitation to others, Tzion, to sing. There's the invitation to the reader of this song to join in the song, maybe to himself. And as we'll see later on, in a different part of the davening, there's the claim that the davening makes that Shabbos is also singing. Shabbos is singing a song too, not just we. Mizmor Shir Yom Shabbos is taken, doesn't mean that literally, but it's taken by our prayer service, we'll get to it, that the Shabbos itself is singing. Here we have one of, if not the most popular Jewish song of all the services, Ucha Dodi. So I think we'll have to stop at this point. And the next paragraph is very interesting. Lo tevoshi v'lo tikal mi, because that is taken from a different source. I want to talk about that. It's a response to what we've said so far. And then we'll complete Ucha Dodi, we return to the Shabbos. It's interesting that actually the words of Ucha Dodi are not that difficult. It's not, sometimes you have some of the piyutim impossibly difficult. This is actually very simple, relatively simple, but we should really pay more attention to the sources, because the sources where our Kabbalah is drawing from, apart from the mystical stuff, which is very much there. But for us, I think the idea of going through all this, I felt could be helpful in terms of seeing how the nature of the Shabbat is reflected in our service, what Shabbat could be, what Shabbat is about, what ideally is in any event. And so next week, the plan next week is to finish Ucha Dodi, finish the Kabbalah Shabbat service. Maybe we'll say a few words about the evening service of Shabbat, and then we'll jump to the day service of Shabbat in the remaining time. But before I stop, are there any comments or questions? Someone asked a question on the chat about the 6,000 years relating to the 6 days of the week.
Yes.
That's found in, I don't know the specific source. It's found in various midrashim, and the Ramban Torah cites it as well. But it's very much reflective of what I just said. Ideally, Shabbos relates to the end of time, and that the other 6 days are sort of preliminary to the ultimate goal of creation, which is the Sabbath. So the Ramban cites it. It's an early source. I believe it's a Gemara in Sanhedrin, but I wouldn't swear to it. I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of these sugars are found, in the last chapter of Sanhedrin, Perichelek, and I'm pretty sure that the Talmud speaks of, according to one view, the different views. According to one view, 6,000 years of creation. Each set of 1,000 represents something, and then you have the Sabbath at the end of the 6.
So Rabbi Silber, you're saying that the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan, these are all attempts of return to get fragments back from from Gan Eden. This is sort of, is that the goal? Not really. I mean,
yeah, I would say that whether it's actually Gan Eden, the Ramban believes it's actually Gan Eden. The Ramban talks about a return to Eden, but even if you don't accept that, it's a return to a perfected world. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
The symbol of a perfected world is Gan Eden. When you go back to Gan Eden itself, as the Ramban thought, or as many others thought, no, it's not that. But it's some kind of perfection. What Shabbos represents is the idea that we are moving towards perfection. Shabbos is a very optimistic day. Shabbos is the claim that the world can be better than it is, no matter what we may think or what we may see. The claim is, and it's pretty fundamental in Jewish tradition, I would say, that we have a sort of optimistic view of the world. It's funny for Jews to have an optimistic view of the world, but the point of fact that is the tradition, that the world is moving towards the Sabbath. It may take a long time to get there, and there are many obstacles in the way, but the claim, and it's the claim of Ucha Dodi, is that in entering into Shabbat, we imagine a better world. The Kabbalists would say, we who dwell in the last of the Sfirot can imagine Tiferet. We who dwell in Malchut can imagine Tiferet. L'shem Tiferet, someday we'll move towards Tiferet. That's the claim of L'chadodi. It's an optimistic claim. It gives one hope. I think that's part of the Shabbat as well. It's a day of rest and a day of hope. Okay, I'll stop here then. Next week we'll continue. Thank you for joining.
Thank
for
you
joining
so
us.
Toda
Thank
Rabbi.
you for joining us. If you want to learn more with us this month, you can find out our full classes at drisha.org/classes. Our next upcoming class is Heschel's The Prophets with Dr. Dor Brandi today at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.